Okay, hello. My name is Juliane Lemcke. I'm a technical expert for the timber sector for the Swiss Import Promotion Program, SIPO. I worked in the industry, import-export industry, and also in the certification business. I worked for the European Commission through the FLEG facility and have been working now in my position as a technical expert in the timber sector for SIPO for a couple of years. So today I will introduce you to the new proposed law of the European Union. And yeah, I will start with the first slide. Yes. All right. First slide. So, because it's not in place yet, it is a proposed law. In March 2021, the European Parliament adopted a resolution with recommendations to the European Commission. So this was a draft document with recommendations for a directive on mandatory human rights, environmental, and governance value chain due diligence. So this resolution calls on the member states to implement some measures to ensure that companies conduct adequate due diligence in relation to human rights, the environment, and governance risks. So, applicable to which companies is or will the new law be applicable? And the directive should apply to all large undertakings. That means those which are exceeding at least two of the following criteria. There are three criteria. The first one is 20 million euro balance sheet total. Balance sheet total is assets is, which is liabilities and equity. Then 40 million net turnover, or 250 employees on average during the relevant financial year. The directive should also apply to publicly listed SMEs, so small and medium enterprises, so not just to large companies, and that's very important to note, and to high-risk small and medium enterprises. So certain sectors and certain companies are high risk, and the EU Commission will have to clarify who exactly is going to be high risk. So the directive will apply to undertakings governed by the law of the EU member states, but also on non-EU undertakings that operate on the EU's internal market by selling goods and providing services. So it goes beyond Europe. So what are the obligations? The obligations are that the company has to carry out due diligence covering its whole value chain. So that means direct and indirect business relationships, upstream and downstream. So the companies are then obligated to identify and address and remedy aspects of their value chain that could infringe on human rights or the environment or good governance. So that means all operations, direct or indirect, investment chains, all that is included. So the sub-suppliers of the suppliers, the logistical companies, the financial companies, and so forth. So they have to carry out a risk analysis. They have to implement a due diligence strategy. They have to ensure that their business partners carry out adequate due diligence, and they have to engage with stakeholders. And also, if there have been some infringements, establish adequate grievance mechanisms. And the companies should publish their due diligence strategies, which will then have to be re-evaluated at least once a year. So what are the consequences of non-compliance with the law? The member states shall be required or will be required to ensure that a civil liability regime is in place, which means provisions to hold the company liable for infringements of applicable human rights, environmental, or governance standards. There will be no criminal penalties. So that means that people will not be charged with a crime if there is if there are some infringements. But there will be administrative fines, and these might be very high. As an example, the EU Data Protection Regulation has fines of up to 20 million euros or up to 4% of the worldwide annual turnover of a company. So that's a really high fine, so it could become very expensive. And furthermore, the companies might be excluded from public procurement, state aid, or from public support schemes, such as export credits or other things that other potential sanctions that member states could impose. So this is a really strong consequence for non-compliances. This is a picture of examples with national acts. So at the moment, there are a few countries that have already implemented some acts in terms of due diligence, and they have gone before this due diligence. So in that respect, so the countries have followed their own individual path when regulating human rights due diligence obligations, and they have often limited themselves to a specific theme or a particular region of application. And even though the due diligence obligations are essentially identical, countries have framed and defined due diligence obligations in different ways. One example here is the German government or the German National Act. The government has recently adopted a draft of Supply Chain Duty Care Act, and it's a lot less strict than the one of the European Union now, and will have to be strengthened when it comes into law. So the main thing is that in Germany, it relates to the first tier of suppliers and only to big companies in the beginning. So from 2023, companies with more than 3,000 employees will be affected by this law, and by 2024, it will be companies with more than 1,000 employees. But I guess it will be strengthened because this EU act is coming, or this directive is coming into force later this year. So this is the German, the slide for the German National Act. Yeah, it's just to say that, for instance, and I go back to that previous slide, examples would be France with the Loi de Vigilance. So this is a protection of human rights. It was already passed in 2017, and it firmly anchors the corporate due diligence for human rights. So French companies are obliged to identify and prevent those infringements, and yeah, it also applies to subsidiaries along the chain. In Great Britain, the Modern Slavery Act was already passed in 2015 and was enacted in 2016, and that protects the supplying companies of all forms of slavery, because the UK companies have to identify and mitigate Yeah, another such example is the Netherlands. It has a strong child labor due diligence law since May 2019. The Dutch Senate, the first chamber, has approved this law, which was already passed in 2017. This law obliges companies to comply with child labor due diligence requirements and provides also for complaint mechanisms and sanctions in case of non-compliance. So you see that the due diligence in Europe, due diligence for human rights, for protection of the environment and governance, which means like bribery and so forth, will strengthen a lot, and that puts a big burden onto the buyers, and they will then pass their requests and their obligations onto the suppliers to deliver evidence. This is what I wanted to say for this law. The possibility to ask questions, but for the moment I thank you for your attention.